Welcome to Blueprints for Liberty, Designing the Freedom Cities of Tomorrow. This is a podcast that explores the visionary concept of freedom cities and how we can create living environments that prioritize individual liberty, social harmony, and equal opportunities for all. We look back through history to see how the past informs the future and how people can self-organize in their communities to support self-sufficiency. We also look to develop leaders that are moral and ethical in a world that is spinning out of control. Tune in to be part of the conversation shaping the future of our communities. Hello and welcome. We have Seth Fleischauer. Hope I said that right.
You did. Thank
Oh,
you.
good. And he's with Bannon Global Learning. And I'm very excited to talk to him today because he has two things that of particular interest to me, and I'll let him get into those in a little more detail. But first of all, coming out of the COVID era with all of the distance learning and all of the complaints we had about how ineffective it was, I would like to talk about how his approach to that is different and why he feels like it's effective. And the other part that's really fascinating to me, because I trying to put together virtual travel tours that are of interest to kids, or youth, I should say. Now, they don't have to be kids, they can be young adults, that type of thing. And how do you make them engaging so that it's really an immersive learning experience? So I'll just turn it over to him right now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here. I always love to get in front of podcast listeners because I have a couple podcasts of my own. One of them is called Why Distance Learning, and it gets into all sorts of things around live virtual learning, something that everybody, well, nobody really had an opinion about until COVID, and now everybody has an opinion about. And some of those perceptions are very real and widespread and accurate. And some of those perceptions could be changed, I think, with learning a little bit more about what's available and the professionals who've been in the industry for a really long time. And that essentially is what the Why Distance Learning podcast is about. We discuss a lot of these perceptions and then dive into the reality behind them. And some of the concerns, again, are very real. But a lot of the successes that continue to occur in the medium are ones that aren't really shared that widely. And so we try to tell that story, but do it in a way that speaks to the reality on the ground, not some kind of rose-colored glasses. I have another podcast called Make It Mindful: Insights for Global Learning. And that one is about global learning, which is the type of educational experience that we expect for students who want to be successful in an interconnected world. So we're talking about issues like cultural competence, language skills, digital literacy, because that's the way that you connect to a lot of people internationally, some action-oriented learning, awareness of global issues, some local global connections, these types of things. And the work that Banyan Global Learning does is very aligned to global learning. It's in the name. And that's what that podcast is about. So where do you want to go first, Cheryl?
Well, let's start with the virtual learning. Like I said, I've come from the corporate side of things, and we've been doing, distance learning, virtual learning for a very long time. Now, having
Mhm.
said that, I don't think we've been doing it very effectively. I, I think in the last couple, probably, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, we've done better at it. But even still, having been able to engage adults with distance learning on a higher level than before, in the back of my mind, I'm just like, how in the world would you do that with young adults or kids whose
Mm.
attention span is, that of a gnat, and, keep them engaged and make them excited to be there? Because to me, let me just step back just a little bit of some of my educational background. And I don't go into my professional educational background because I don't even think it's really relevant. What I think is relevant is, growing up, learning to me was just this. I love to learn. Everything was a new experience. I was just like so excited to learn all kinds of new things. And when I got married and had children, there were a lot of people that were putting their kids in preschool and they wanted their kids to learn their ABCs before they were in school. And all this type of thing. And I was like, I think I'm going to take a slightly different approach. And this comes back, the reason I'm going this direction is because this kind of comes back to your global learning initiative too, is that if I can teach my kids to love learning, I don't need to worry whether they're going to learn their ABCs or one, two, threes or whatever. They are going to want to engage with this kind of experience and to make learning experiential so that I'm not just sitting down and doing a math worksheet. I'm actually learning how math applies in the real world and especially science, that's always fun. And of course, I'm a big history lover. So, let's not learn about dates and, people's names and places and things like that. Yeah, that's relevant, but relevant within the context of what story does it tell? So that to me is what learning is all about. And so from that angle, I think I'll let you run with it from there.
Yeah, so I mean, what you're talking about is intrinsic motivation, and intrinsic motivation is a hell of a drug. It's a pretty fantastic way to learn, and it's the ideal scenario, right? Like it's the holy grail. If you can facilitate intrinsic motivation in any given student, you're right. You can kind of sit back and let a lot of the pieces just fall into place. How you get to that intrinsic motivation, I think, is going to be different for almost every person because we are unique beings. Of course, there are, you know, some general approaches that you can take, general categories of interest that different kids have. But I would say that it's somewhat of a truism of teaching, at least a modern take on teaching, that if you can reach a student in a way that speaks to them individually, that you can really foster that intrinsic motivation. And relating that to distance learning and to global learning, I think that there is no like you mentioned like I couldn't imagine how you would keep a kid engaged when they have the attention span of a gnat and they're trying to learn online. And I think that recipe for engagement is going to be a little different for each kid. It's going to depend on the teacher, it's going to depend on the content, it's going to depend on the kid, on the time of day, on the preparation. And so there are, if you back all the way up, it's like, okay, well, what makes good distance learning? Well, let's talk about what makes good learning, right? First. And then let's make sure that we're practicing those principles as we apply them to this medium. You talked about experiential learning, and it is true that every single person without the aid of the internet is limited to the experience of their geographic bubble. And so if you create a situation where they can have experiences that go beyond that geographic bubble to, I don't know, the rest of the entire world, now you're talking about lots of ways to differentiate that experience so that you can create that intrinsic motivation for any given kid. And I think that is the core value proposition of distance learning is that there are things that you have access to by engaging with your three-dimensional space. And those things are, they're the fabric of life, right? Like, of course, you want to engage with that space. Absolutely no one is arguing that you should have distance learning only. That should be the entirety of your existence, right? Life is education. And simply going through your life with curiosity, looking at that flower and wondering why it has that pattern, talking to that person and wondering why they responded the way that they did when you thought that they might respond in a different way. I mean, these lessons are all over our lives if you just look for them. It's constant. But the same is true of the online world. And what you've done is you've just expanded the possibilities of experience by untethering learning from geographic space. And I think that's where the great potential is. New people, undiscovered places, fresh ideas. That's what we talk about at Banyan. If you can uh, gain access to an expert that doesn't live in your rural town, if you can meet people from a culture that you would never have had access to, if you can be exposed to some ideas that are not shared by the majority of the people you live around, these are the types of things that can begin to expand someone's understanding of the world, and in doing so, also enhance their understanding of themselves. And that really is the goal, right? Learning about other people in other places, other things in other places, it's a window, but it's also a mirror. Being able to see through the window and notice, oh wow, that's a little different, but that's kind of the same as how I live. What you're doing is you're also piecing together what your cultural identity is, because without that foil, you have nothing to compare it to, right? It's like the people who like insist they don't have an accent, right?
Yeah,
Right? Everybody has an accent.
yeah.
It's just that you're used to your accent. That seems normal to you.
Yes.
But turns out like you're abnormal to someone else. And being able to piece those things together, it takes that exposure to be able to do that.
It does. And I think there's a whole lot to unpack there. Going back to kind of the attention span of a gnat. For better or for worse, I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole of, ADHD and all that kind of thing. But I think kids inherently have the, less than an adult attention span. Let's just say that, right? And
Some
some,
adults, but yeah.
yeah, some more than others. Yeah, yeah. And that's as I get older, I'm like, man, my attention span really has gone out the window. But there's a couple things I learned too, is that even kids with legitimate ADHD or ADD or whatever it is, one of the biggest complaints that people who don't understand the condition have is that, oh, I put something in front of them that they're not interested in, and I can't get them to focus for even a few minutes. But you put something in front of them that they're interested in, and they're like consumed, and they are just like, and so it goes back to what you talked about, knowing your students, knowing the individual, what motivates them, what inspires them to want to learn, kind of thing, I think is really critical. And that also goes back to your idea, which I agree totally. Let's take the basic foundations of what makes people learn and find a way to translate that into a virtual world. And that's in the corporate space, that's one of the things that we did or tried to do, and with varying levels of success. And the other thing that have found interesting is, and this is another one of those hot button topics, is video games. Kids will sit down and they'll just be engrossed in a video game, but yet you can't get them to, clean their room. Well, I mean, that's a given, right? But what I found was interesting was my son had a lot of learning disabilities, and he had diagnosed, ADD. And I went downstairs and he was only at probably, I don't know, 10, 11 years old one day. And he was playing a video game, but it wasn't one of these first person shooter, I should say, kind of games where there's just so much happening and all this kind of stuff, going on the screen and flashing, stuff. He was playing Civilizations, and I thought, wow, this is a pretty
At what
complicated.
age?
Yeah, 10.
Woo. All right. It's too hard for me, but okay.
I, I know. And I was like, I know, I was baffled, I was like, what is going on here? And he just was deeply engrossed in this game. So it really made me step back and say, okay, what is it about video games? What foundational learning elements are there? And one thing I learned, is it's funny because I have a tendency to think that there's not a lot of difference in the pedagogy between, you know, children learning and adults, but there is a few things that are unique. Like if you want a kid to learn a video game, you don't sit down and give them a instruction manual.
Mm,
The game is the instruction manual.
yeah, if it's a good game.
Yeah, if it's a good game. But most, and so you put an adult down in front of a video game and who's never played video games, and they're going to be like lost, like give me the instruction manual. They want to learn from that. They don't like failure. Where a kid playing a video game will try and fail and
It's
try and
built in,
fail,
yeah.
and they'll level up, and then there are all these little Easter eggs, I guess they call them. I'm not a video game expert, but you go and you find clues and you explore and all this kind of thing, right? So as I've tried to incorporate some of those ideas into adult learning, adults don't like that. They this is sad to me too, and maybe you can talk a little bit to this, is as adults, I think we like to be spoon-fed, where I don't think kids want to be spoon-fed. They want to explore. They want to go find those Easter eggs. They're okay trying and failing. So I don't know. Those were the things that were coming to my mind as you were talking.
Yeah, I mean, adults is a pretty large group.
Yeah,
Right? So,
exactly.
so
Very generalized. Sorry.
yeah, it's a bit, but as you say, there are certain trends, right? And I think, yeah, adults want to know what you're about to teach them, how it's going to. They really want to know how it's going to relate to their life, right?
Mhm.
Like, tell me exactly why I need to know this because my time is limited, my attention is an effort, and I realize and recognize all this as a mature person who has a certain amount of self-awareness. And so I've been in too many situations where I've wasted my time learning something I don't need to know that you need to like front load me with purpose. And
Yeah.
if I don't have that, then I don't care. Right. So I think that is definitely true of adults with adult learning. With kids, yeah, they're born to explore, right? Like, and I think that can be true of a lot of adults too, but and I don't, there's this sort of reality of where we're at. And I don't want to sound like I'm complaining about this stuff, but capitalism, the like traditional ways of learning, these are things that kind of funnel people into like specializations and like rote production that kind of saps some of that wonder, curiosity, exploration out of you in order to be able to like be a cog in the machine, right? And there are a lot of things that come along with that can be very positive. In some ways, this is the most comfortable time in history to be alive. But it can kind of sap your soul a bit to not have those moments of pure, unadulterated exploration and wonder. And I really try to practice that in my life just separately. Like how am I practicing adventure in my life, right? Like how am I making sure that I'm not falling into rote routines of my own choosing, you know? Uh, but it's funny that you bring up video games. I'm in a conversation with my wife right now. I'm trying to lobby to get my son a console. He spends a lot of time on Roblox. He loves Roblox. He's probably on some kind of spectrum. I'm not super interested in getting like a diagnosis at this point because I think the learning comes down to do these interventions work for this learner or not? And it kind of doesn't matter what label you slap on it. You just have to know what are the approaches that are going to work. And so if it's helpful to have an ADHD label so that you can see the strategies that have worked for a lot of other kids who have that label, great. Try those strategies, see if it works with your kid. And there are certain strategies that do work with my kid. And yeah, you could say that he has the attention span of a gnat sometimes, but you give him anything that he's interested in, and he is deep
See?
in there, right?
Yeah.
Deep in there. And video games are one of those things. And I mean, video games, it's funny, like, I don't know how we arrived at this idea that play was bad. But, and I think it's related to these like systems around like you can't play on the factory line, right? Like there's not like room for exploration
Yeah.
when your job is to do this very specific thing so that the entire machine of your company and your industry and your country can run the way it's intended to. There's not a lot of room for play in there, but we're obviously born to play. All animals are born to play. That's how we learn initially. And I don't know, like, at what point play became like a villain, right? But it definitely did so for video games. And I think there's this confusion of not all screen time is created equal. And this is one of the things we talk about in global learning is like digital literacy, digital competency, media literacy. They're like you are making a mistake if you think that playing Civilization is the same thing as scrolling TikTok. Like one is incredibly passive,
Mhm,
incredibly addictive with very little upside.
mhm.
Depending on your algorithm, there's a lot of great stuff on the internet. I love the internet. It says a lot of funny things, a lot of creative people. There's a lot of cool stuff out there, and there's opportunities for self-expression too, right? So there is that part of social media. But playing Civilization, and for people who don't know what Civilization is, this is a very deep video game where you essentially have to create a civilization that thrives. Like picture Sim City, like taken to like the nth degree, where you've got like, other civilizations that might potentially war with you. You've got resource management, you've got political considerations. What type of government do you want to create? Like it is deep, and there is a whole lot of learning there, right? So like I would say that's a great example of like one end of the spectrum of like this is not a passive experience. It happens to take place on a screen, but it is deep. It is impactful, and it practices a lot of the things that a lot of video games do, even like Mario Kart, right? Like that's more of like a just a tactile experience. But you're talking about like, goal setting, achievement, like problem solving, critical thinking. You're developing skills and mastering them, right? And you're doing it through exploration, through making a mistake, low stakes mistakes,
Yeah.
building up to mastery of something. You're talking about, in some cases, like collaboration and social learning, persistence, right? Like the idea of like, I'm going to make it through this challenge because I want to get to the other side of that wall. Right. I mean, that is a life lesson. You've got like for some of these games like Civilization, like resource management and planning. For something open-ended, like, there's like storytelling and opportunities for like creativity and innovation, spatial awareness, visual, like there are so many benefits to video games, yet they've been like vilified. And this is not to say that like you shouldn't have guardrails, right? Like these things can get very addictive, but that's another opportunity for learning, right? Like when I talk to my kids about, and I talk to other parents, because like with Banyan Global Learning, we teach students in one-to-one classrooms. So these are students who are probably like bringing their iPads home with them. They're spending a lot of time on iPads during the school day. And so one of the big concerns with parents is like, well, first of all, eye strain. So you can have like special glasses to like prevent the blue light from getting in there too much. But then there's like the addictive nature of screens. One solution is to just say, here are the road here, like let me take your iPad and create rules so that you can't engage past 30 minutes or past 60 minutes with this category of app. I'll be honest, that's what I do with my kids because we tried this other way of like giving them some ownership around it, and it's just too powerful. It is too powerful a drug, the dopamine kick of
Yeah.
this, of the even the educational games like Duolingo, right? Like that's something that's awesome for learning, but like my son will sit there for 2 hours on Duolingo. And like
Mhm.
eventually I want him to like look around, just like smell
Come
something,
eat dinner.
you know? Yeah, yeah. And I think that like, you know, being able to have those safeguards in place and then gradually lift them so that you are preparing the human to make their own choices around what is healthy and what is not healthy for their media consumption. And this like talks about, not only the amount of media consumption, but also the types of media consumption. And this is where it gets into some like SEL work where it's like, how does this stuff actually make you feel? Right? If you take a moment, if you take a beat and breathe, like where is the feeling in your body right now? And just start with like, is it good or bad? Right? Like just start like positive, negative. Do like a charge exercise with it. There's a
Mhm.
lot of social media out there. It it doesn't make you feel good. Like,
Ooh.
and like I have to do this all the time with the Reddit. Like I like Reddit. I like the way that you can curate your experience. I think that it's got some of the best advice on the internet, some of the communities on Reddit. But you have to be selective, and you have to practice what I call hygiene, like digital hygiene, right? Like these algorithms are out to get you. Right? Like they are out to make whatever it is that you're looking at something that you want to look at for even longer. And so I have to like systematically go through my Reddit feed and be like, don't show me this anymore. Don't show me this anymore. Don't show me this anymore. And I use it as an example because I think it's a particularly aggressive algorithm. It'll pop things back up into my feed that it knows my limbic system wants to see, right? Like my limbic system wants to be outraged, right? My limbic system wants that little kick of cortisol to get a little like amped up and ready to fight,
Mhm.
right? And I like my prefrontal cortex. does not want that anymore, right? I don't want to be outraged. I don't need that in my life from the internet. There's
Yeah,
plenty of ways that I can like
the real
go through
world.
life. Yeah, yeah, like, there's just a lot of toxicity out there. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't enhance your life at all that you don't need to know about every day. And you can stay informed without obsessing. And so practicing that digital hygiene for me, it has to do with sort of like world news politics, like I want to see it but I don't want to see it, so I have to practice like staying away from it. For a teenage girl, it might be, what kind of images of femininity am I looking at, and how does that making me feel about my body, my beauty. I have a 12-year-old daughter, and like, we're embarking on like that time of awareness for her, right? So these are all skills that I think need to be taught. I think that there's a place for them in schools, especially because schools have thrown computers in front of kids without teaching any of this kind of stuff. I mean, COVID, it was just like, okay, now kindergartners have laptops.
Mhm.
And so I think that schools have a responsibility to help prepare students for what is inevitably their digital future. And I think that parents also need to be brought into that conversation. Schools as houses of education are places that where I think these conversations can start for a lot of families. But parents also need to like look at their own digital citizenship, right? Like I practice hygiene with my stuff. I think about how is this stuff making me feel? Did I spend too much time on my phone yesterday? When is my cutoff point where I'm no longer looking at my phone and instead I'm reading before I go to bed, like reading like a book with pages made out of paper, yeah, from
Yeah.
trees. These are things that like when we coach parents, it's like first step, simply have awareness, right? Why are you making the decisions that you're making? Because the minute you're making them without awareness, you're not in control anymore, right? And you are simply a slave to the screen, you're a slave to the algorithm. And that's the way they're designed. They are designed to make us into that. And so we need to be hyper vigilant about our own behavior. And if we can practice that for ourselves as adults, then we can model it for kids and have meaningful conversations with them about it. Whereas if you're just like, get off your phone, I told you to get off your phone, that means nothing when you're on your phone, you know?
It does, and it's so interesting because, you know, I'm clearly older than you, and I'm old enough to remember
Was
that.
that clear? I'm not
uh,
sure that's clear. I just got my hip replaced.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not there yet, but hey, but I'm just think it makes me think back, when I was in high school, and we didn't I mean, computers weren't even a thing, and
Yeah,
we
me
certainly
neither.
didn't have a computer in our pocket. That's crazy. But I remember girls being, we looked at teen magazine, we looked at all of these, but we weren't being even then taught to be self-aware. It was like I looked at that girl and I thought, wow, I would like to look like her, you know?
Hmm.
And then what do I do to look like her? Well, I need to starve myself to death and I need to put on lots of makeup because I certainly don't look like that in real life. And, so it was we didn't look online to find these types of things, but we still looked for these types of things and looked into that, realm, but without the self-awareness. And that's where, we demonize, technology. We demonize video games, and you're talking about all these wonderful things that video games can teach, but making yourself aware of the impact that they're having and how is this impacting me? How is this game, if I'm playing some, and I can't think of the name off the top of my head, where they go and steal cars and do things like
Grand
that.
Theft Auto.
Grand Theft Auto, thank you. The most famous one. See how often I play these things? Never. But, is this teaching me a good lesson? And what am I taking? Because you brought up, I have a little book called The Ambition Quotient, and I wrote it as I was going through my corporate learning because I was dealing with so many kids who were coming out of college, no creativity, no team building skills, no communication skills, none, no resilience, no problem solving skills. And I'm like, I see you. engage with all this stuff in a video game environment and you're getting it there, why is that not translating over here?
Hmm.
So that once again, you know, when I, because I did a lot of onboarding with young people in my corporate career. And as I come through and they would be lacking some of these skills, I would take them back to their video game days, even if I didn't play the video games they played, and say, you learned it here. Why aren't you learning it here? And this was the number one response I got across the board from these kids when I would really make them answer that question, not me, but them answer that question. And I think the other thing that we do too with kids is I'm seeing it now that I have two 7-year-old grandchildren and a 4-year-old. My 4-year-old came just a week ago and she was just, we live on 8 acres out in the middle of nowhere. She wanted to be outside
Hmm.
all the time. She wanted to explore everything. We have a bird bath. She spent an hour and a half out there in the freezing cold making lunch in the bird bath. And she got these leaves and she put these little berries on them. And her mother is incredibly gifted when it comes to artistic type things. And I could just see that artistic part of her, and she plated this beautiful thing and brought us, our lunch, kind of thing. And I was looking at my 7-year-olds who came the week before, and they were just like, nah, nah, yeah. And I was like, but I remember just a few years ago, you were just like her. What happened? I'm like, uh-oh, you went to school where you sit at a desk, you sit in a desk, all of a sudden, she had no rules out there except she wasn't allowed to go beyond certain boundaries, but with 8 acres, there's a lot of boundaries. And, she had a few rules she had to adhere to, but not nearly all the rules you have. And I'm not saying that we don't need to teach kids rules and boundaries and things like that. That would be extreme. But me personally, putting a kid in front of a teacher all day long sitting in a desk is like, oh, yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen a whole lot of value in that. But then just forcing them into, you're going to learn this math and you're going to learn this, reading is no longer about, oh, this is exciting. Look at the story and everything. It's all about, okay, how do you decode all these letters and things? And that's all part of it. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that somehow we need to keep capturing that beauty of learning and without stifling it by all these rules that we place around learning. And that was kind of what I was getting at with these students that were coming into the workforce was they couldn't translate all that wonderful things they were getting in the video games into the workplace because now all of a sudden they were, like perfect example. I These were all interns, and interns, everybody's famous, for getting coffee. That's all interns do. I was like, no, my interns don't do they don't do coffee. They're coming here to learn. And we always gave them a project and they would, I'd give them an assignment, they'd come and they'd be like, here it is. And I'd be like, great. And we'd go through it and we'd say, okay, I like this. We need to work on this and this. And they're like, what do you mean? Like, give me a grade and I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, that's not how this works. This was step one.
Yeah. This is level one
Yeah,
for video
level
games.
one.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about a lot of stuff here.
Yeah, I know.
The
I could be here for hours.
well, I mean, the most recent thing you're talking about is like transferable skills, right? Transferring skills. And I think that is that's the end game, right? Like you learn skills not so that you can apply them to this very specific context typically, although there is some of that in hyper specialized fields. But especially early in education, you're learning these skills so that you can transfer them to any given situation where they might apply. And that's something that comes very naturally to some kids. And it's something that needs more structure and scaffolding for other kids. And so that goes back to the knowing of your student and how can you help facilitate that transfer for this particular kid. And a lot of the times maybe all they need is awareness. But at other times, maybe it's, uh, recognizing how certain elements of life are gamified, right? Like an example would be as a parent, or even let's say you're in a elementary school classroom and your kids have to clean up room after any given activity, right? And so there's a place for things to go,
Mhm.
and you can have a certain amount of knowledge about where those things go, but ultimately, eventually, you're probably going to come across something where you don't know where it goes. And you can throw up your hands and say, I don't know where this goes, and give up on that in that given task. But if you were playing a video game, you'd probably wander around until you found something that made sense. And you would probably put it into a category that was not random, but made sense for that thing, right? So like if you found some duct tape, you might put it with the clear tape. Or if you found brushes and there was no place for paint or brushes, you put it with the pens because they have a similar thing. Or you put it with the rulers because they have a similar structure to them, right? That categorization is like a game. And it's the same thing with like my daughter loading the dishwasher. She was really struggling to load the dishwasher. I was like, this is Tetris, right? Like this is right. Like this is a game of like, how can we get the
Yeah.
most things in there
Mhm.
whilst they're still, have access to the bottom of the dishwasher so that they're getting the water jets and they're getting clean,
Mhm.
right? Like it's a game, and
Mhm.
these games are everywhere, right?
Yeah.
They are throughout life. Like it's a game to like figure out the fastest way to get somewhere in a car. Like we started to like, hey Vita, like that's my daughter's name. Hey Vita, you show me how to get there,
Yeah.
right? Like, these little puzzles exist all throughout life. And so the more we can model and talk about the way that like our skills transfer from one to another, the more that kids can start to put those pieces together. Another thing that you were talking about that I wanted to like kind of back up to, you were talking about the like magazine that we
Yeah.
had when we were kids, right? And there's a Venn diagram of like digital literacy and media literacy.
Mhm.
And in the middle is digital media literacy. And there's a whole bunch of stuff around like
Mhm.
how to have a healthy relationship with digital media. But media is everywhere. Media is the book you're reading. Media
Mhm.
is the magazine, the music. Media is the packaging of that food product, right? Like there is media everywhere. And there are a lot of best practices around media literacy, regardless of whether or not it's digital. And the biggest thing I try to practice with my students and with my kids is who created this, right? Like just back up. Who created this? Who is it for? What do we think they were trying to accomplish? And if you can just have that conversation, there are like 10 more questions you can ask and get deeper on this. But if you just have that conversation, you can start to, oh, yeah, they're trying to sell lipstick,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? They're trying to sell makeup, right?
Mhm.
And how are they doing that? They're trying to make me feel like I need lipstick, I need makeup in order to be beautiful,
Mhm.
right? Like if you can start to connect those dots, you are a step ahead in your relationship with the entire world, not just with the digital world.
Right. And that's where I think that rather than vilifying all of these different types of technologies, so the analog versus the technology, side of the world is like you said, better understanding them and being more using the technology to make yourself more aware. Like when you know, I was listening to this guy the other day and I really like him. He wrote a book years ago called Boys Adrift. And he was talking about, absolutely never let your kids on TikTok, never let your kids on social media until they're like 18 or something. And I was like, okay, is that realistic in the world we live in today? Because I learned one thing with my kids. If I don't turn the TV on in my house, guess where they're going? To their friend's house. And their friends are going to be turning on the TV. So rather than just totally banning the TV from our house, it was like we have limited amount of, TV time or whatever you want to call it, screen time nowadays. Let's talk about what's on TV. Let's talk about how
Yeah,
it makes you
let's do it
feel.
together.
Yeah. And let's talk about what's going on here and what messages are they sending? I was always, and I always get in trouble for this, but I hated The Simpsons. And why did I hate this? I know. How could anybody
I,
hate The
I'm in
Simpsons?
Portland, Oregon, and Matt Groening's from here, so
I
don't
know.
don't speak too loudly when
I
you're
know.
here in
Well,
Portland
I
with those
can't say it
words.
too loudly because my husband is absolutely a Simpsons fan. So we had a difference of opinion here about this, but I was like, I just don't like the way to me, it portrays Homer Simpson as this bumbling old fool of a dad. And I'm like, I don't want dads to be portrayed as these bumbling old fools. You know what I mean? But rather than banning my kids from watching Simpsons, why not have that conversation? You know? And so many things, and especially with all of the cartoons and things nowadays, if you just turn your kids loose, there are so many, and there's always been subliminal messages. I mean, I remember Roadrunner and things like that. There were subliminal messages back then.
It's
But
pretty overt, but yeah.
yeah, you know, use them as teaching opportunities. Use them to take and translate that what their world into the world in which we live. And being self-aware, I think, is just so important. When you brought that up, I was just like, oh, we just don't teach our kids to be self-aware. We don't teach them that if I look at this and I look at this, you know, as a teenager, I went and put makeup all over my face so I could look like this girl in Teen Magazine. And I'm like, ooh, I still don't look like her. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
number one, I don't know how to use makeup very well, especially as a 12-year-old. That's why
Buy
my
more
mom,
teen magazines.
yeah, I know. That's why mom doesn't let you have makeup at 12 years old. Of course, it's one of those contraband. But anyway, so, what does it make me feel like? And just because it makes me feel good doesn't mean it's good because illicit drugs can make you feel good. What do you, and, as your kids start getting older and experimenting with things like that, let's talk about what's missing in your life that you feel like you need this drug to make you feel that way. Of course, they're not going to be able to identify it right out of the gate, but having those conversations, you know?
Yeah, I think a step before that is okay, it makes you feel good. What about 10 minutes from now? How do you feel now?
Yeah.
Right? Like that dopamine crash is something that is applicable to screen use as well, right? It's like, cool, cool, cool. I feel great. I just looked away for 4 seconds and now I feel really compelled to look again,
Mhm.
right? Because like, what was that feeling, right?
Yeah.
What was that feeling there? That feeling of withdrawal,
Yes.
right? Like, that's where you can provide context to the
Yes.
positive feeling that you're getting from the dopamine high. If
Yes.
you can recognize that it is coupled with the crash, then you can start to make more informed decisions about how you are getting that joy in your life.
Yes. And I think we're about at our time here, but we didn't even talk about what I started down. I'm always into having further conversations if you're up for that, because I really would like to talk about and take this conversation to the place where, you know, how can we make educational screen time, especially from a one-on-one. And I know it goes like we talked about, going back to understanding, who the student is, what are their needs, what are their interests, what's going to, motivate them to want to engage with this material. And that's very important. And definitely even in the, adult world where we did this in corporate America, that was number one. Like if nobody's interested in the topic, you're going to really struggle to get people, on board with you. But I do think it
Yeah,
would
I mean,
interesting to go there.
I can kind of tease it out for you a little bit, right? Because it's not a simple answer.
I
What I work on my podcast is these perceptions of distance learning and then teasing out what the reality is. And in most cases, the reality is at very least complicated and not as simple as the widespread perception. And
Mhm.
so I can tell you that these perceptions fall into a couple of different categories. One of them is about the effectiveness of distance learning and the engagement that occurs in the medium. Another one is about culture and relationships and how easily those are formed in a digital realm. Another one is about equity and accessibility. One of the amazing things about distance learning is that it gives you access to all of these different experiences, but is that access equitable, right? That's a question. And then there's like innovation and potential, right? Like you experienced something when you were forced into distance learning during the pandemic, like every other person in the world. But is that what distance learning is, or is there potential for there to be something else? And so these perceptions kind of fall into those four categories. And what we do on the podcast, Why Distance Learning, is we kind of break those down via the lived experience of one of our guests. So we can talk about, with innovation and potential, the perception is that distance learning is just a boring Zoom call. We will bring on Ben Newsom of Physics Australia, who's been in this industry for 20 years and can speak about all the things that he does that do not fall in the category of being a boring Zoom call, right? And we can bring in some research about all the different types of distance learning tools that exist out there, all the different things that you can do to enhance engagement and not make it just a boring Zoom call. We bring in some of our old guests. We've got like 50 episodes in the can right now. So we'll bring in some of the perspectives of our old guests and throw that in front of our guest and ask them what they think about that particular path. And so that's like the format of what we do. And what we're doing again is breaking down like what are the things that people think are the limitations, to what extent are they actually limitations, but to what extent can we break through those barriers? And that, again, it's those four major categories, but we have like I think it's 12 perceptions that we work with and break down, and we're adding them all the time. So again, the answer is pretty complicated, but there are things that you can do for each of these that can make it better. But there's also some real limitations out there and some real concerns that are valid.
Well, I think the answer then to that question is listen to your podcast.
Perfect. That's what I was going for.
Exactly. Good motivation there. So tell us how we can access your podcast and so we can learn more because I definitely very interested in this subject.
Yeah. So really, wherever you get your podcasts, Why Distance Learning, you could also go to cilc.org/podcast. That's the Center for Interactive Learning and Collaboration. My co-hosts are a part of that organization. And my podcast, Make It Mindful, about global learning, that you can find again anywhere you get your podcasts, but on our website, which is banyongloballearning.com/make it mindful podcast with hyphens in between. It's not a great slug, but I'll work on that. I'm going to change that to /podcast. We're going to do that. banyongloballearning.com/podcast. I will get my tech guy to switch that up, or you can just Google Make It Mindful. Transistor.fm is another place to find information about the podcasts. You've got all the information. I mean, really just Google this stuff and you'll find it on like the 27 platforms that these get pushed out to when you publish them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for your time today. I appreciate you coming on. I always love talking about education, probably obviously one of my favorite topics. So
Yeah,
always
I really appreciate the conversation. This was great. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
all righty. Well, thanks, and let's stay in touch.
Sounds good. Have a good one.
All right, thanks.